Continuing my interview with Amy Anderson, we'll be talking about her family a little bit and also Amy's adoption and about Korean adoption.
And then my mom, like I said, she was mostly a mom, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But she was adopted herself. She was adopted domestically. She was born in St. Paul, Minnesota. And actually, back in the day when they had orphanages, she lived in an orphanage until she was like a toddler. And she was adopted by my grandparents, who are way deceased, when she was, I think, 2 or 3 years old. And she actually says she remembers being in the orphanage, which I think is like mind-blowing to me, because I was adopted as an infant. And then my 2 oldest brothers are adopted from Western Europe, and then my 3rd brother is my parents' only biological child, and then he's 2 years older than me, and then they adopted me from Korea when I was 5 months old.
Yeah.
Early 70s.
And I think you told me when we had talked
We're
before,
so interesting.
Very interesting. You don't exactly know your birthday, do you?
Well, I mean, from what I understand, it's fairly estimated, because here's the thing about Korean adoption. This could be like a whole PBS series talking about this, but so I won't go on too long about it, because I could like talk about it forever. But Korea, a lot of people aren't aware, because right now everybody's like, oh, like we adopt from China and Vietnam and Russia and blah, blah, blah. But the whole international adoption business, because it is a business, is changing pretty radically right now, because people are starting to realize that it's a little weird and it can be a little shady. And this is not placing any judgment on people who have adopted, because I have so many friends whose children are adopted internationally. This isn't what I'm talking about. It's not what my point is. But Korea was the country who pioneered international adoption. They were the first country to do it after the war, after the Korean War, of course. There were lots and lots of legitimate war orphans, and so there's a whole history there. But anyway, the industry became kind of an industry after that, though. I mean, after the need was not really there anymore, they had pretty much set up an industry and saw profit. So they kept their international adoption program open, and I mean, for a long time there was just sort of this weird kind of believed myth that you were adopting children from Korea, that there were still like these orphans over there. And when Korea was becoming like a first world nation and becoming very prosperous, and like tons of adoptions came out of Korea in the 80s and 90s, when they were like starting to take over the electronics world and stuff like that. So, and now they're like the 11th or 10th largest economy in the world. So clearly there's no need to be essentially selling their children anymore to other countries. So it's a fascinating thing, and it really did become an industry of transaction of selling people. And these children who were adopted were and are, or became, they weren't initially, they were orphans, but after there weren't any orphans anymore, they became children who were the children of unwed women.
Okay.
Women who were not married, because that was very taboo, and a whole bunch of stuff there too. So anyway, but what I was getting at is that I was adopted in the 70s, and because it was a little bit of like a thing where like women were often preyed upon to like, you know, you should give your child a better life, you're a single woman, you'll never make it with this child here, like, because the society back then was so shameful back then that like even a woman, if she were single and had a child, like she'd have a hard time getting a job. She couldn't register her child in their like national registry that they had there because it didn't have a father's name. She was kind of like, her kid might not receive a good education. Like there was, people really were ostracized. Wow. And so it's my belief that a lot of these agencies kind of preyed upon these women, and then would often pay for their medical expenses in exchange for, you know, the child, and the child would be adopted. And so, and the mom doesn't get anything out of it other than like the reassurance that her kid's going to have this great life somewhere else. And because of that, the records are very shady from my generation particularly, where so many of us have been told like, oh, your orphanage burnt down. Records are gone. It's not funny, like so many of those orphanages burned down. Or a lot of people, we have our American file, and then like would go over to Korea and go into the actual office and demand to see the Korean file, and there would be like all this information that was hidden from us. So I did a full birth search, and there was a little more information in my file. Like I didn't know that I had been in a foster home for a while, and there was a picture of my foster mother there, which I thought was fascinating.
How old were you then?
I came to the United States when I was 5.5 months, so I was just an infant, you know.
Right.
But this family had cared for several foster children, like I think it's like 40 different foster children, like over the years, and it seemed like they really cared for the kids and really were doing it out of the goodness of their heart. And so, I mean, that's interesting, but because of that, I really don't have any information. And so what it says in my file is that I was left at a train station in Seoul. It was called the Yongsan train station, which is still there. And I was just left until a passerby picked me up and brought me to a police officer. And then the police officer, the police department, like handed me over to Children's Hospital, where I was probably examined, and then handed over to the orphanage. And so, but what I've been told is that what was common back in the day is like if a young woman or a woman who was unwed, like had a baby, she would sometimes leave it in a very public area like that and just hide and wait to make sure that somebody picked it up, because they knew that eventually it would make it to a place, because that would like be a kind of a very anonymous way of making sure their child got to a safer place without having to like literally like do it themselves. And so who knows? I mean, that whole story could be a complete fabrication anyway, but that's all I really have. And so it said that I was estimated to be 1 to 2 days old, and that I was found on like September 2nd, I think. So my birthday was written down as September 1st. So that's, who knows? I could actually be like much younger. You know Kevin Shea? He's a Korean adoptee comedian too who lives here. He found out, he's a Korean adoptee, and he went over and he found out that he was a year younger than he always thought he was.
What?
Yeah.
Nice.
And I think he was 30 at the time, and he found out he was actually 29. He was like,
Yeah, you're like...
bonus.
So...
That was long, sorry, but
No,
it is
like
one of those things that I could really like. I think people really don't know. They really don't know. There's a lot that goes on in that business, and
well, one question you mentioned the word business. Now, so are you saying that some people are really profiting on this?
absolutely.
How so?
Well, I mean, these families pay tens of thousands of dollars to facilitate these adoptions. You don't think the birth mother's not getting anything? I never got anything.
You got a great family here.
Somebody's profiting. I mean, and of course they have to keep up the covering medical costs at these single unwed women's homes, and then like the children are living in these homes until they're adopted, that sort of stuff, or like going. So I'm sure the money goes to cover those types of things, but at the end of the day, it's still a transaction. It's a business like any other. We have a product. You want a product. You give us money and you can have the product. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, really, if you ask me.
And it still exists?
Mm-hmm. And I'm not 100% up to date on what the current situation in Korea specifically is, but last I heard that they were proposing to have their international adoption program closed fairly soon, like by 2016 or something. And they did close off several countries. Like Germany used to be a country that could adopt from Korea, and they closed adoptions off to Germany, and so slowly they're just like
so then you grow
shuttering up their windows.